This one is called Run for the Hills, and this one is based on prophecy. And I'll explain that right away. So the key text for this comes from Luke 21, verses 20 and 21. And this section of text here, which is more verses than just these two, comes from Jesus, and it's an end times warning that he's giving to his disciples and ultimately to us, because it was written down for us. And it appears in two other gospels as well, but slightly different in those. But essentially the same things are there, as you'll see here. And so this verse is Jesus telling us about some of the things that are going to happen late in the end times. And so what he says is, but whenever you will see Jerusalem, so he's talking about Jerusalem, being surrounded by armies, know then that its destruction has come near to it. And let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are within Jerusalem escape, and those in the villages, let them not enter into Jerusalem. So he says a few things there. He says, if you're in Judea, so that Judea is like a province or a state, and around Jerusalem. And so he says, if you're in Judea, run to the mountains, flee, get away. And he says, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by the armies, it's going to be time to go. And he says, and those people who are in Jerusalem need to escape. Get out of Jerusalem as fast as you can, run to the mountains. And he says, those who are in the villages, now those would be the little towns outside of Jerusalem. He says, don't go into Jerusalem. Whatever you do, don't go in there. You want to be ready to head out and flee to the mountains when the time comes. So this run for the hills idea appears, as I said, in Matthew and Mark as well. And so it's an important idea for us. Jesus is telling us something significant, but most Christians don't understand what this fleeing is all about. Why do they need to flee? What's happening? Where are they actually fleeing to is another question. In fact, Jesus' disciples are going to ask that exact same question when we get near to the end of this. So all of this comes from something I've mentioned many times before, and it's kind of a key piece of prophecy, and it's called Daniel's last week of years. So a week of years is 7 years. And this week of years is kind of a key piece in prophecy because it ends with the second coming. And so when you know that you're in this 7-year period, you really know that your time is almost up. And you will know because there are signs for it. The 7-year period begins with an agreement about the sacrifices on the Temple Mount, that it seems to be allowing the sacrifices to begin or to continue on the Temple Mount. And right now, that's just not possible, not even something that could be dreamed about yet. So as I said, this the 7 years that Daniel talks about, actually it's an angel telling Daniel about these 7 years. It begins with this agreement for sacrifices on the Temple Mount, and it ends with the second coming. And so that's why it's really significant is once you know you're in the 7-year period, you know that you're very close to the second coming. And for us in this particular lesson, we need to understand that there's another part of that. Halfway through that 7-year period, the beast, who is also called the Antichrist, attacks Jerusalem and stops the sacrifices. And the verse in Daniel that talks about that says, and he will confirm a covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come the one who makes desolate, until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, gushes forth on the one who makes desolate. So a number of things are happening here, and this is talking about that attack that's going to happen. The beast is going to come into Jerusalem, and he's going to put a stop to the sacrifices and the grain offerings, and he's going to, we see in other passages, not here, that he's going to declare himself to be greater than God and set himself up in the temple to be as though he was God. And so this is when that attack comes. It's right in the middle of that 7.5-year period. We don't know exactly when it happens, but it's in that, like, there's 3 to 4 years after he stops those sacrifices, and that he does that. So I mentioned the who's Messiah, but I'm going to skip that for now. That doesn't take us anywhere. So this beast or Antichrist is the cause of the running to the hills that we saw in the very first verse. What he does there means it's going to be time to run, to get out of Jerusalem and run for your life. And what he's going to be doing, we know from other passages, and I haven't included all of them because there's so many of them. He's going to be leading a large number of nations at that time. And he's running around doing military conquests, and he decides to go into Jerusalem. And his plan, his unstated plan, is that he's going to remove all the Jews from Jerusalem and scatter them around the world. He's going to clean all the Jews out of Jerusalem. And we understand that that's already a common goal in the world, so it's not a big surprise that he would try to do that. And we see that in Luke. It talks about that in Luke 21:24. And it says, and they, the Jews, shall fall by the mouth of the sword, so killed by the sword, and they shall be led captive to every region, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles will be finished. And so Jesus right there is saying, when this attack comes, those people who are still there, those who haven't run for the hills, are going to be, some of them killed by the sword, and some of them are going to be led captive and into every region, so taken out of Jerusalem and spread around to every region of the world. So that's what this is all about, this running. So the people, the Jews in Jerusalem and Judea, when they see these things happening, they need to run for the hills and not delay, not pause. They need to run and get going. And so and we know now why, because this guy is, when he surrounds Jerusalem with his forces, it's not going to be apparent that he's going to be doing this. It seems like he's just sort of there to visit the temple. And there isn't, you wouldn't at first think that there's any reason to be worried about his forces there. He was just out on a military conquest and he stopped by Jerusalem. That's what it's going to be like. But Jesus says, don't believe that. Get out of Dodge. It's time to go. And so he's going to enter the temple and do something to desecrate it. The Bible doesn't say exactly what, but it does say it's going to be a lot like Antiochus did back in Greek times when the Greeks had taken over Jerusalem. And what he did was he sacrificed a pig in the temple, and so that desecrated the temple. So he's going to do something to desecrate it. We don't know exactly what he's going to do, but he is going to desecrate it like Antiochus did. And then he's going to begin that attack and begin capturing the Jews and killing some of the Jews, as that verse up there said. And there's an Islamic prophecy about this, which is really interesting. Why would Islamics have any idea about this? But they do. And so this one is a hadith from one of the followers of Muhammad. He says that Muhammad told him that Judgment Day will not come until the Muslims fight the Jews. The Jews will hide behind the stones and the trees, and the stones and trees will say, "O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there is a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him." And so that's the exact same thing that we're seeing here is the Jews being slaughtered. The Muslims who are there are going to be out to kill the Jews, and the other people are out to just move them out of Jerusalem. But God's not going to let this happen, at least for those people who are paying attention. He has a plan to make an escape for them. And that's what the running to the mountains is part of. So this comes from Zechariah now. And so this is a verse that Jews in the present time know. They wouldn't know what Jesus said about all of these things, but they have this. And this really makes it pretty clear that there's going to be this time when they're going to have to get out and flee. So from Zechariah 14, verses 3 through 5. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle, but God fights differently than we do. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives will be split in its middle from east to west. So it's going to be cracked right from east to west, forming a very large valley. Half of the mountain will move toward the north, and the other half toward the south, and you will flee by the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains will reach to Azel. So he says, Zechariah says, and there are some other places that talk about this too. There's going to be this split in the Mount of Olives, which you wouldn't currently think. Mount of Olives is a fairly large hill. I wouldn't call it a mountain because I've seen much bigger mountains. But nonetheless, the Mount of Olives is going to be split in its middle from east to west, and the halves of the mountain are going to move. They're going to move north and south, leaving open a valley in between them that is called by Zechariah the Valley of My Mountains. So, and this valley is eventually going to be flowing with water. There's going to be water coming out of Jerusalem at a later time that's going to flow down through this valley, down to the Jordan River and the Dead Sea, and turn the Dead Sea into clean water, not salt water. And right now it's a pile of very salty water. So so the Jews have access to this prophecy, and if they're reading this, They're going to be able to, when they see that split in the mountain, they're going to say, oh, time to go, and hopefully they will do that. But we know from what the Bible says, what Jesus says, a lot of them aren't going to do that, and therefore a lot of them are going to be captured and some of them killed. So, and the reason for that is that many in Jerusalem are going to be caught not watching. And Jesus spends quite a bit of time talking about this idea of not being ready, not being watchful. And because of that, bad things happen to you. And he's going to use Sodom as an example here. And so these verses that we're going to look at here, and we're going to look at about 3 or 4 slides of these as Jesus continues on with this idea of preparedness and being watchful and ready. So what's happening here, this is not from Jesus talking about the end times. This is actually something about Jesus talking instead about the idea of being ready and watchful all the time. And that comes from a different question that Jesus was asked. So although they're in different places in the Bible, they're still talking about the same topic. So, and what Jesus says, and again, just as it was in the days of Lot, they were eating and drinking and buying and selling and planting and building. But in the day that Lot went out from Sodom, the Lord Yahweh caused it to rain fire and brimstone from the sky and destroyed all of them. Thus shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. So what he's saying there is the people of Lot had no idea that disaster was coming. They were just going on with their lives, doing the usual thing, eating and drinking, buying, selling, all of that stuff that people do. And they were not paying attention to anything that God wanted. And so when Lot headed out of there, they didn't think anything about it. That's when disaster fell on them. So because they weren't watchful, they weren't prepared, disaster fell on them and they weren't ready for it. And so he says, Jesus says, thus shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. So he says, he's going to be talking about this same event in Israel where Jerusalem is attacked and a lot of the people are not watching and not prepared. And going about their lives as usual when destruction comes upon them. And so continuing on, this is still Jesus talking in that passage from Luke 17. And he says, in that day, whoever is on the roof and his stuff in the house, let him not come down to take them. And whoever is in the field, let him not turn back. Remember Lot's wife. Now that's really significant. When the beast begins to surround Jerusalem, as we saw in that first verse, the people need to be ready to go. They need to be ready to run to the hills, and they're not going to be able to carry a bunch of stuff. If they have a backpack, they've got time to grab that and run, but there's going to be no time to pack up all their belongings and take them along with them. So they need to be ready to go. And Jesus adds this warning about Lot. He says, don't let your desire for the things you have cause you to turn back as Lot's wife did. And remember the story there. She still liked an awful lot of things about Sodom, and she turned around back because she didn't really want to be leaving them. And so her heart was still there. And that's what Jesus is saying. Remember Lot's wife. Don't let your heart be in Jerusalem and cause you to slow down. You need to, when the time comes, you need to run for the mountains that have split and created this valley that Zechariah talked about. And that needs to be their thinking, but we know for sure that it won't be the thinking of everyone, but it will be the thinking of some of them. So some people are going to be prepared, and they're just going to grab little bits they can grab, and then they're going to run and move. None of them are going to try and take anything big with them. Continuing on in Luke 17, Jesus says, whoever chooses to save his life shall lose it, and whoever will lose his life shall find it. Now that's a general expression that is used elsewhere, and it's kind of a general message to everyone in Christianity and in Judaism, really. If you are trying to save your life, you're going to lose it, and whoever will lose his life shall find it. And so continue on with verse 34. I say to you, in that night, 2 shall be in one bed, one shall be taken captive, and we know what is meant by captive now because we've seen that this is the beast taking Jews captive, and the other shall be left, and that's going to be the person who ran away. 2 women shall be grinding meal together, one shall be led away captive, and the other shall be left. 2 shall be in a field, one shall be taken captive, and the other shall be left. So Jesus is saying there's going to be a real division here, and if you aren't prepared, and remember this is from the preparedness message of chapter 17. So he's saying that if you aren't prepared, you're going to be caught in your bed asleep and taken captive. But if you are prepared, you're going to be able to get away and make haste, be gone when the trouble comes. So the idea here is that the residents of Judea need to leave their possessions behind, and really that means leave their lives behind. Everything that perhaps important to them, the things that they had, the house that they had, the lives that they lived, all of those things they have to just run away from and give those things up as though they don't matter to them. And that's Jesus' message to them at that time. But it's also a message to us that we shouldn't be so entangled with the physical things of life. We should be ready to abandon them, and the physical things shouldn't be things that hold us back in our spiritual walk. And so that same message applies to us in a way too, but not in the same literal sense that is being used here. Jesus is saying literally, if you don't make this run for the mountains, you're going to be taken captive or killed, worse. And so what's going to happen to these people is when they do, if those people who do run away, they will give up their lives, all of their possessions and things like that. They're going to lose all of that stuff, but they will find their Messiah. And that's the thing that's really important, not the physical things that they owned. Okay, still finishing up here in Luke 17. And they answered and they were saying, now this is the disciples. They answered and they were saying to him, to where, our Lord? So they're asking him, where are these people supposed to flee to? You said flee to the mountains, but what does that really tell us? And he says something to them that is that a lot of people have had a lot of trouble understanding. He says, wherever the bodies are, there the eagles shall be gathered. And this seems to be a reference to generally not just eagles, but to all carrion birds like vultures. And so any animal like that, if you know anything about them, they somehow have this knowledge about how to find dead bodies. And we also hear stories about them circling overhead over the people who are not yet dead and still struggling along, but are likely to die very quickly. And so these carrion birds seem to have a sense that they can tell where the dead bodies are. And so whenever there are bodies dead or dying, they are there ready to take advantage of those and feast on them, because that's what they eat for their food. So that's what he's talking about, is this sense that eagles and vultures have of finding bodies that are dead that they can eat on. And so the meaning is, so this is what is called an idiom. It has a kind of a hidden meaning that isn't clear from the actual words of it. And so the meaning seems to be, when the time comes, you will know. So just as the eagles and the vultures have this hidden understanding of where to go to find dead bodies, then you will know where to go at that time. And so he's not explaining to them exactly what Zechariah says, but if they would look at Zechariah says what's going to happen. He says the Mount of Olives is going to be split and create a valley between them, and you'll run through that valley to get away. Hope that's clear enough. Okay, so concluding all of this, we saw that there will be a time when Jerusalem is going to be attacked by the beast, which we also call the Antichrist. There are many names for him, man of sin and other things. When he does, his goal is going to be to get all of the Jews out of Israel, to throw them all out, and probably to replace them with Muslims. And we know from our time that Muslim relationships with Jews haven't always been good. And one of the focal points of that has been the existence of Jews in Jerusalem. So no surprise that we would see this. But in this case, God is going to step in and defend those people who are watchful, who are ready and prepared to give up their lives, give up everything that they own and run for it. And they have the faith. They have the faith to do that. And that does require faith, is to throw away everything you've got and make a break for it, run for the hills. And we do know very clearly, because Jesus said so, many people are going to be taken captive instead, because they weren't ready. They didn't run, and they thought they would stay and try to protect their property. And so instead of running as they should have been, they were captured. And those people who are captured and survived, we also know from what the Muslims said that a lot of them are going to be killed. Jesus said the same thing. Those who do survive are going to be distributed around the nations, so kicked out of Jerusalem and Israel and spread around the nations. And we also saw that this is going to happen 3 to 4 years before the second coming. So if you're alive to see this, you can start the clock. When this happens, count down 3 or 4 years, and the second coming is there. So And now, understanding all of this, how do we come to understand all of these things? And the answer is that this event is described in a whole bunch of different places. Twice in Luke, I mentioned, two different places. In one place, Jesus is talking about end times events. In another one, he's talking about being prepared. And he uses the same event to talk about those different topics because both of them are relative to that. But to get all of these verses together to understand these things, you have to look at Daniel, Isaiah, Zechariah, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Revelation, and probably others that I haven't thought of here. And so this whole event is hard for people to understand because it is spread all over these books in pieces, and you need to take all the pieces and assemble them together to make them make sense and to see these things. And I've tried to do that for you here today.